Just another aging nurse who'd peaked decades ago. That's what Dr. Caldwell said when Megan O'Brien walked past him in the ICU corridor at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. He didn't say it to her face. He said it to the two residents trailing behind him like remora fish, and he said it loud enough that she heard every syllable bounce off the stainless steel equipment carts. Megan kept walking. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She'd learned to move that way a long time ago, in Tikrit, when sound meant bullets. The residents glanced at her, then away. Nobody made eye contact with someone Dr. Caldwell had already decided to discard. Megan had worked nights at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston for 3 years, moving through the ICU like water finding its level. She arrived at 10 p.m., clocked in without speaking to anyone, and spent the next 12 hours monitoring patients with the kind of attention most people reserved for their own children. Surgical precision. That was what her old commanding officers called it. The ability to assess a critical situation in 2.3 seconds and know exactly what needed doing. She'd applied that same precision to 4 lines, medication administration, wound dressing changes, and the 1,000 small nurses that kept people alive in the hours when the sun wasn't watching. The other nurses said she was reliable. The doctors barely registered her presence. And that was exactly how Megan wanted it. She pushed through the double doors into the ICU proper, where the machines did most of the talking. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Cardiac monitors beeped their steady count. For pumps hummed their digital lullaby. Megan moved to the med station and pulled up the night's assignment on the computer. For patients. 2 post-op cardiac cases. 1 septic elderly male from the ER. And 1 new admission that had just come through from Walter Reed an hour ago, a Navy SEAL general with combat shrapnel wounds to the thoracic cavity and left leg, requiring specialized vascular surgery and post-operative observation. Her hand moved to her chest before she could stop it. Beneath her scrubs, against her ribs, hung a single dog tag on a broken chain. The tag was engraved with her name, not her civilian name, the other one. Major M. The Bryan, USN. She touched it twice, a habit from a different lifetime, and let her hand fall away. Professionalism. Distance. The only rules that mattered now. The general had arrived in a wheelchair, his left leg wrapped in compression bandages, his hospital gown tied loose over a chest already wrapped in trauma tape. He was broad-shouldered and square-jawed and carried himself like a man who'd spent 23 years giving orders that other people obeyed. When Dr. Caldwell had wheeled him past the med station to wardroom for 07, Megan had been reviewing medication charts. She'd glanced up for exactly 1 second. Their eyes had never met. But she knew who he was. She knew that his name was General Robert Halloway. She knew that he'd commanded Naval Special Warfare Group 3 out of Coronado. And she knew that her son, Lieutenant Jackson O'Brien, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, would follow that man into any fire without hesitation. Would have followed him into Tikrit if orders had gone differently. If a classified operation hadn't gone sideways. If the Navy hadn't buried 12 good operators under redacted paperwork and told the survivors to disappear. Megan pulled up General Halloway's chart and began reading. She read like a surgeon reads pre-op notes, not skimming, but tracking every detail, cross-referencing symptoms against treatment protocols she'd learned in field conditions that made hospital textbooks look like children's books. Shrapnel wounds. 2 pieces had been successfully extracted. A third, lodged near the left subclavian artery, was too risky to remove in theater. Post-op orders showed pain management, antibiotics, vascular monitoring, cardiac monitoring every hour. Beta blockers for rate control. Standard post-trauma protocol. She wrote everything down in her nurse's notebook, the one with the worn leather cover, and cross-referenced it against the hospital's medication formulary. Her handwriting was neat, economical, the same precise script that had documented field expedient tracheotomies and blood loss estimates and names of the dead in a sandstorm outside Fallujah. The muscle memory never left. The hands remembered even when the mind tried to forget. Those notes are excessive. Dr. Caldwell appeared beside her with the sudden presence of someone used to making entrances. He was 47, silver-haired, with a kind of tapered suits that cost more than Megan's monthly rent. "We have an electronic chart system, Miss O'Brien. Surely you've noticed." She looked up. His eyes were the pale blue of someone who'd never stood in genuine darkness. "Paper is redundant," she said. Her voice stayed level. "But I keep my own records." "For what purpose?" "To slow yourself down." He smiled without warmth. "You're already running behind the other shifts. Don't compound the problem with unnecessary procedures." He gestured toward the general's room. "General Holloway will receive the same standard care as any post-op vascular patient. Nothing heroic. Nothing outside protocol. And certainly nothing that requires handwritten documentation from a nurse who's been here long enough to remember when we used carbon paper." The residents laughed on cue. Nervous, sharp sounds that evaporated in the fluorescent hum of the ICU lights. Megan set her pen down. She turned back to her computer screen. "Yes, Dr. Caldwell." He waited another few seconds, as if hoping she would argue or defend herself or give him something to work with. When she didn't, he moved on, his shoes clicking sharply against the tile as he made rounds with his entourage. She could hear him in the next room, voice carrying that particular tone of command mixed with contempt. "Vitals are stabilizing, though his pressure remains elevated. I attribute that to pain, not cardiac compromise. Monitor closely but don't call unless his systolic drops below 80. And page me immediately if his oxygen saturation falls below 95%. Not 96. 95. One of the residents cleared his throat. "Dr. Caldwell, that's a fairly low threshold. Most protocols." "I'm familiar with protocols, Dr. Kim. I write the protocols for this hospital." His voice flattened into something that sounded like knives in a drawer. "Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." Megan listened to the exchange without turning her head. Her jaw clenched once, a micro-movement, then released. She'd learned the difference between the kind of doctors who knew more than their textbooks and the kind who used textbooks to hide how little they actually knew. Caldwell was the latter. That threshold, 95% oxygen saturation, was conservative enough to be safe in most cases. But for a post-op vascular patient with compromised lung capacity from shrapnel trauma, it was dancing on the edge of dangerous. It left no margin for error. No room for the small fluctuations that happened naturally during sleep or position changes. But that wasn't her call to make. She'd spent 3 years not making those calls. 3 years staying quiet, showing up on time, doing exactly what was asked and nothing more. Invisible. Interchangeable. Just another aging nurse who'd peaked decades ago. She stood up from the med station and made her way to room 407 to introduce herself to the general. Her limp was barely noticeable these days, just a slight drag on her left side, remnant of an IED strike in Tikrit that had cost her 2 men and a career. She wore long sleeves to cover the shrapnel scars, pale and thin as old surgical cuts. Her hair was graying at the temples. She'd stopped coloring it 3 years ago. There was no point. General Holloway was awake, staring at the ceiling, his face drawn with pain and something else, the particular exhaustion of men who'd survived things that shouldn't be survivable. He turned his head when she entered. His eyes were dark brown, intelligent, the kind of eyes that miss nothing. "I'm Megan O'Brien, your night nurse," she said. She didn't extend her hand. Didn't make it personal. "I'll be checking your vitals every hour, monitoring your dressing changes, and managing your pain medication. If you need anything during the night, use your call button. I monitor them constantly." He nodded. Something in his expression shifted for a moment, a flicker of recognition that didn't quite solidify. Then he looked back at the ceiling. "Thank you, Nurse O'Brien." She adjusted his flow rate, checked his chest dressing, documented his baseline vitals. Heart rate 104, elevated but expected. Blood pressure 138/89, controlled but not optimal. Oxygen saturation 98% on supplemental O2. Pain rating 7 out of 10. She made note of everything in both the computer and her leather notebook, and the computer system flagged none of her observations as concerning. As she left the room, the dog tag beneath her scrub shifted slightly. For a moment her fingers went to it again, that old habit, and she felt the sharp raised edges of the engraving. M. the Brian. Major. A rank she'd held in another life. A name that had been buried along with the classified details of an operation in Tikrit that hadn't gone the way the Navy had planned. She didn't know that General Holloway would remember her name by morning. She didn't know that he'd spent the last 3 years wondering what had happened to the tactical genius who'd saved his life in a sandstorm. She didn't know that her son was going to call the hospital in exactly 8 hours with news that would change everything. All she knew was that she had a 12-hour shift ahead of her for patients to monitor, and a doctor who was waiting for her to fail. She went back to the med station and pulled up the next set of vital signs that needed checking. The hospital hummed around her, machines breathing for people, lights fluorescent and shadowless, rain beginning to hammer against the windows outside. October in Houston. Warm even at midnight. The kind of weather that made the AC work overtime and reminded Megan of other climates. Other rooftops. Other lives that had ended in her arms. She pushed those memories down where they belonged and got back to work. But something had shifted in the ICU when General Holloway arrived, though nobody noticed it yet. The presence of a general, even a recovering, wounded one, changed the atmospheric pressure in a room. And Megan had always been sensitive to pressure changes. It was the military in her. The part that couldn't stop scanning for threats even when it had been ordered to disappear completely. She didn't know what was coming. But some part of her, some ancient, trained part, had already begun preparing for it. The overhead paging system crackled at 8:38 p.m., cutting through the quiet hum of the evening shift. Megan was at the nurse's station reviewing the general's chart when she heard it, the careful notation in Dr. Caldwell's handwriting that made her spine straighten. A beta blocker. Propranolol, 40 milligrams, ordered just 90 minutes ago. She knew his cardiac profile. Tutors had taught her how to read medical records the way other people read faces. The general was already on verapamil for the arrhythmia triggered by shrapnel fragments lodged near his right atrium. Beta blockers and calcium channel blockers together weren't just contraindicated. They were a formula for cardiac collapse. Hypertension. Heart block. Potentially fatal. She walked to where Caldwell stood dictating notes to a resident, her footsteps soft on the tile floor. The resident looked up as she approached. Caldwell didn't. Dr. Caldwell, the general's current regimen includes verapamil, she said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical laser. The propranolol creates an interaction profile that. I went to Johns Hopkins, Nurse O'Brien. He didn't look up from his dictation. Where did you go? A community college in the 90s. The resident's pen froze mid-note. 3 other nurses suddenly became very interested in their computer screens. Megan took one measured breath. I'm concerned about the interaction profile. The combination increases risk of. Your concern is noted and dismissed. He finally met her eyes, and there was something almost gleeful in his gaze, like a man who'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending. Follow the order. And next time, don't waste my time with your armchair diagnostics. He turned back to his dictation. The resident resumed writing, refusing to meet Megan's gaze. She stood there for 3 seconds, her jaw clenching once, then turned and walked back to the medication station. The silence in her wake felt like a held breath. 20 minutes later, the overhead paging system crackled across the entire 4th floor. Can Grandma Megan please report to the supply closet? Grandma Megan to supply 3. Laughter rippled through the hallway. Not loud, careful laughter, the kind people make when they're not quite sure if they're allowed. A nurse at the charting station bit her lip. A resident pretended to study a chart. Dr. Caldwell stood near the ICU talking to a cardiologist, and he didn't look up, but Megan saw the corner of his mouth twitch. She set down her pen. Removed her gloves. Folded them carefully and set them on the desk. Then she walked toward the supply closet on the east wing, her movements unhurried, her face composed with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. The supply closet door was propped open. She pushed through it. Caldwell was waiting inside, and he closed the door behind her with the soft precision of a man who'd planned this moment down to the detail. The fluorescent overhead light buzzed its mechanical song. "You're going to listen very carefully," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "Question my orders again and you'll be job hunting by Friday. There are 50 younger nurses who'd kill for your position. You're here because I allow it. Because I decided 3 years ago that having someone to blame when things go sideways was good insurance. Do you understand?" She met his eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't step back. She didn't let her hand shake, though somewhere deep in her chest, a carefully buried part of her, the part that had interrogators' voices still ringing in her ears after 20 years, recognized the threat pattern. Isolation. Humiliation. Removal of authority. Psychological pressure designed to break compliance. It hadn't worked in Tikrit. It wasn't going to work here. A tear escaped. Just one. She watched Caldwell's eyes widen slightly, a flash of satisfaction crossing his face like he'd finally broken something. She didn't wipe it immediately. She let it sit there, proof of her humanity, and then she raised her hand with the same steady precision she'd once used to feel dress a wound under fire and wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "History has a way of correcting men who mistake silence for weakness," she said. The words came out quiet. Not angry. Not desperate. Just true. Caldwell's expression shifted. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, uncertainty, maybe. Unease. Then he covered it with a smirk. "That's supposed to scare me." She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked out of the supply closet, back to the nurse's station, where every single person pretended they hadn't been watching the supply closet door. She sat down at her computer. Pulled up the next chart. Returned to work with the same methodical focus she'd maintained through 3 years of his contempt. What happened next didn't begin until dawn. But the real nightmare had already started. The parking lot at Oak Creek Memorial held the particular grey emptiness of 6:22 a.m., that moment when the night shift is thinning but the day shift hasn't yet arrived. Megan was walking to her car, her badge catching the first pale light, when she saw Caldwell standing near the main entrance. He was holding papers. As the day shift nurses began streaming in, the arrivals that happened every morning at 7:44 a.m. sharp, he moved to intercept her. Deliberately. In the exact center of the gathering crowd of incoming staff. "Megan," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the parking lot. "We need to discuss your reassignment." He handed her the papers without waiting for her response. She took them. Orderly duty. Effective immediately. The reason cited, performance concerns. Failure to follow established protocols. Inability to work within institutional hierarchy. Every word was calculated. Every word was a lie. Caldwell turned to address the crowd of arriving nurses and residents, rain beginning to fall in soft sheets across the pavement. "Let this be a lesson about chain of command," he said. "In a hospital, hierarchy exists for patient safety. When someone refuses to understand that, they get removed." Whispers spread through the crowd like spilled water finding cracks. Megan stood holding the demotion letter, rain beginning to darken her scrubs, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. In Tikrit, she'd learned that explanations only work when the person asking for them actually wants the truth. She looked down at the papers in her hands. Read the letterhead. Saw his signature at the bottom, the same signature that had ordered medication that could kill the man in ICU 4. Then she looked at Caldwell. Met his eyes one last time in the parking lot. And said nothing. She turned and walked to her car without looking back. Her hand went to her chest, beneath her scrubs, where the dog tag hung on its broken chain. She gripped it hard enough to leave marks on her palm, the metal edge pressing crescents into her skin. "Pain is information," her training whispered. "Pain is data." This was intentional. This was strategic. This was the move of a man who'd realized she might interfere with something, and he was removing her from the board. She didn't know what that something was. Not yet. But every instinct honed across 3 tours and 2 Purple Hearts was now awake and running calculations. That evening, Megan reported for her new orderly shift at 10:02 p.m., changed linens, emptied waste, the work of someone beneath the notice of the attending physicians. Her new uniform was a different shade of blue, deliberately visibly inferior to the nursing scrubs she'd worn for 3 years. The message was clear in every thread. She folded hospital corners with the same precision she'd once used to fold field maps in the back of a Chinook, each crease sharp enough to cut. The limp in her left leg, the one she'd been managing for 18 years since Tikrit, seemed more pronounced after the long day. By 2:19 a.m., she was changing linens in the West Wing, her cart stacked with clean sheets that smelled of industrial bleach. The alarms came at 2:53 a.m. They didn't come as a gentle warning. They came as a scream, the high-pitched shriek of a ventilator in distress, layered beneath it the rhythm of a heart monitor accelerating into territory it shouldn't reach. Megan's hands froze on the fitted sheet. That alarm pattern meant tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. Oxygen dropping like a stone. And it was coming from the ICU. She dropped the linen. Moved without decision, her body running on recognition rather than thought. The orderly cart was left mid-hallway as she walked toward the ICU, her limp barely visible now, her movements taking on that quality of controlled precision that came from somewhere ancient and trained. The ICU doors were propped open. Inside, she found chaos wearing a pretense of order. 2 first-year residents stood frozen beside the general's bed. One had his hand shaking as he flipped through a procedure manual. The other stood with a phone, staring at the call directory as if it might suddenly translate into action. The general's color was wrong, a gray-blue that meant his oxygen saturation had already dropped into the 60s. His chest tube lay disconnected on the bed, its sterile dressing hanging useless. His lung was collapsing into vacuum. "Where's the trauma team?" Megan asked. The resident with the phone looked up, panic flashing across his face as he registered her orderly uniform. Dr. Caldwell scheduled a mass casualty simulation drill. Everyone's in the simulation wing. We can't get. How long? 15 minutes minimum. We're trying to reach. Megan walked to the patient board on the wall. Scan tonight's schedule. Caldwell had personally rewritten it. Only 2 inexperienced residents. Minimal nursing staff assigned to the ICU. A mass casualty drill that conveniently removed all senior trauma personnel. No attending physician within response distance. This wasn't an oversight. This was calculated. The general gasped, a sound like a man drowning in air. His saturation monitor showed 58% and falling. His heart rate had climbed to 168. He was moving through shock territory into the dead zone, and in approximately 4 minutes, his heart would simply stop. Through the glass walls, night shift staff had begun to gather. Megan saw them, nurses, night custodians, a dietary worker who'd heard the alarm and wandered up from the kitchen. Faces watching. Waiting to see what would happen next. She stood at the threshold of the ICU room, knowing that what she did in the next 60 seconds would change everything. She was ordered to disappear. Ordered to let the Navy erase Major Megan O'Brien from existence. Ordered to assume a civilian identity and never surface, never claim her rank, never let her training show. The general gasped again, and she recognized the titanium seal trident pinned to his hospital gown. Holloway. Her son's commanding officer. The man who'd written the letters that helped her son get his commission. The man who'd sat across from her 3 months ago, briefing her son's team for an operation she wasn't cleared to know about. Her hands moved. But that wasn't the worst part. The orderly cart felt wrong in her hands. Megan pushed it down the corridor at 6:56 a.m., her fingers wrapped around the cold metal bar, linens folded in precise military corners stacked in the bin below. The scrubs they'd given her were 2 sizes too large, a deliberate touch, she recognized, a costume of diminishment. Around her, residents and attending physicians moved with the casual indifference of people who'd already decided you didn't exist. She was furniture now. Equipment. Something the hospital owned but no longer valued. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone as she entered room 412. She stripped the soiled sheets from the bed, muscle memory from 3 years at Oak Creek bleeding into something deeper, muscle memory from field hospitals in Tikrit where she'd changed field dressings on Marines whose names she still whispered in the dark. The antiseptic smell of the room, the chemical bite of hospital-grade bleach on the linens, the soft creak of the mattress as she fitted fresh white cotton. No one watched. No one asked her opinion. That was the point. By 8:15 a.m. she was on the 4th floor, ICU corridor. The general's room sat at the far end, its glass walls offering a fishbowl view to anyone passing. She'd seen the shift board in the break room, Dr. Caldwell's handiwork, she was certain. The trauma team was scheduled for a mass casualty drill across town. The overnight ICU nurses had been reassigned to the pediatric wing. Skeleton crew. Caldwell had orchestrated it with surgical precision. 2 residents who'd graduated last month. Megan, now classified as orderly support. 1 attending physician covering 12 beds and nowhere near the general's room when the call came in. It wasn't an accident. Caldwell was too intelligent for accidents. He was hedging his bets, running a calculation she understood perfectly. If the general coded tonight, the response would be slow. Incompetent. If something went wrong, there would be questions about decision-making, judgment calls, the adequacy of the medical team. Not about the person who'd ordered a contraindicated medication 3 days ago. Not about him. She changed the water pitcher in room 408, room 410, room 411. Moving methodically. The cart's wheels squeaked softly against the polished floor. At 11:43 p.m., the alarm started. The sound came first, a high shriek of the monitor, primal and insistent, the sound of a body beginning to fail. Megan was 2 rooms away. She moved before thinking, her legs covering the distance in 4 strides. The general's chest tube had dislodged. She could see it immediately, the tubing slack, the dressing saturated with serosanguineous fluid. His left lung was collapsing. Oxygen saturation 74 and dropping. The 2 residents stood frozen beside the bed, their hands moving in vague, uncertain patterns, their faces the pale color of people watching a car accident they couldn't stop. "Get me a 14-gauge needle. Now." Her voice dropped an octave. Command authority. The kind of voice that doesn't ask. The first resident scattered toward the supply cabinet. The second one stood paralyzed, staring at the falling O2 numbers. "You. Manual bag. Do it." He moved. Didn't think about it. Just moved. Megan's hands were already on the general's bedside table. His personal effects bag sat there, the Navy protocol, everything a soldier carried into a hospital laid out in a clear plastic sack. She saw it immediately. The MRE packet, vacuum-sealed, part of his field kit. Her fingers tore it open with the decisive snap of someone who'd done this in a desert with rounds snapping overhead, with dust in her teeth and the pressure of lives depending on her speed. The plastic from the menu insert was waterproof. Military-grade engineering. Durable. Perfect. She fashioned the improvised chest seal with movements that belonged to a different life, and moving like water finding its path, like they'd been waiting for this exact moment for 3 years. The seal went on the wound side with pressure that would hold. Her palpation of his second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, was anatomically precise, the landmark she'd found 100 times in training, 1,000 times in her head, only twice before in reality. Tikrit. The sandstorm. The screaming. The general's commanding officer, then a captain, lying on the hood of a Humvee with his chest beginning to cave. The needle went in. 14-gauge angiocath, silver tip finding the pneumothorax with surgical certainty. Air hissed out, the sound of pressure releasing, of a lung re-expanding, of the body's desperation escaping in a single audible breath. The saturation monitor began to climb. 75, 78. 82. The general's color shifted from the gray of near death back toward the pink of someone whose blood was carrying oxygen again. The first resident returned with the needle. Megan was already securing the site, her movements economical, each gesture purposeful. No wasted motion. No hesitation. I need a sterile dressing and tape. Now. The resident scrambled. Through the glass walls of the ICU, she could feel the weight of eyes. Staff pressing against the transparent barrier. Someone whispered, loud enough to carry, "What is she doing?" The tone held incomprehension. She was an orderly. This wasn't possible. Yet it was happening. The general's vitals were stabilizing. His heart rhythm was sinus, strong, steady. The crisis was ending because she'd ended it. "What was that?" the second resident asked. His voice shook. "How did you know to monitor him? Every 2 minutes." She didn't look at him. Her focus was on securing the site, on ensuring the seal would hold, on verifying that the needle decompression had done what it was meant to do. Pain is information. The general's body was telling her everything she needed to know. Lung expanding. Pressure normalizing. The kind of textbook response that only happened when someone understood the physiology deeply enough to read the body's language. By 1:33 a.m., the general was stabilized. His oxygen saturation held at 94. His heart rate had dropped to 88. The crisis had passed, and she stood in the hallway with blood on her orderly scrubs, looking like she'd just committed a crime instead of prevented one. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 6:15 a.m. He took in the scene immediately, the crowd of staff lingering near the ICU, the general sleeping peacefully in his bed, the nurses stationed still reviewing what had happened in the dark hours. His face went carefully neutral, the kind of stillness that comes from a man recalibrating a failed strategy. He walked directly to Megan. She was folding linens again, back to the invisible work, the erasure. "Nurse O'Brien." His voice carried the careful courtesy of someone about to wield a knife. "You practiced beyond your scope. That's grounds for immediate termination." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words did the work. Around them, the silence that falls when authority speaks. Security arrived 12 minutes later. They weren't rough about it, just professional, just present. They walked her to the employee entrance through the same corridors where she'd moved thousands of times, where she'd held the hands of dying people, where she'd guided residents through their first codes, where she'd become a nurse because the only alternative was letting the ghosts follow her forever. The badge came off at the gate. The system registered her as terminated at 6:19 a.m. exactly. 3 years, gone. By 10 a.m., Caldwell was on the phone with his connections, 3 hospital board members, 2 insurance administrators, a credentials committee supervisor. Reckless, she imagined him saying. Dangerous. Completely unqualified. Practicing procedures she had no certification for. She endangered a patient. The words arranged just so, each one true in isolation, each one a carefully placed stone in a wall designed to ensure she'd never work in Houston again. He had her erased from the system by lunchtime. Her certifications flagged. Her references contaminated. Her file sealed not with confidentiality but with the kind of institutional silence that meant no one would ever hire her. And then she was standing at the employee bus stop, cardboard box in her arms, rain beginning to fall in Houston's thick afternoon heat. The box contained a cracked mug from the break room, a dying succulent someone had given her 3 years ago, and a photograph of her son in his seal trident, his face young and unlined, his eyes still holding the light before the operations that would eventually send his commanding officer to Oak Creek Memorial with shrapnel wounds and a lung that needed a woman in an oversized orderly uniform to save his life. The termination letter was waiting on her locker when she clocked out at 6 in the morning. Not handed to her by HR. Not delivered with protocol. Just taped to the metal door in a manila envelope, formal letterhead visible through the translucent window. Megan's hands were steady as she opened it, though her eyes tracked the words, terminating employment for practicing beyond scope of practice, violation of patient care protocols, insubordination in clinical decision-making. The signature belonged to Dr. Caldwell, medical director. There was a second document attached, a statement claiming Megan had administered an unauthorized procedure without physician oversight, had violated direct orders, had endangered the patient despite the patient being alive and stable with improving oxygen saturation. The lie was elegant. The paperwork was flawless. The timing was surgical. She'd walked past his office on the way out and saw him through the glass walls, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the low voice he used when making calls that mattered. His mouth curved upward as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Board connections, she'd overheard a resident mention. Caldwell had people. People who owed him favors. People in positions that controlled hiring across the Houston medical system. By the time Megan reached the parking lot, her phone had already begun receiving rejection emails from 3 hospitals she'd sent applications to over the years, precautionary outreach in case Oak Creek ever became unsustainable. The emails arrived simultaneously, which meant the calls had gone out before dawn. Before her shift even ended. Caldwell hadn't waited for her to leave the building. He'd begun erasing her the moment her hands had touched that general's chest. The rain started as she packed her locker. Texas rain in late October, the kind that fell heavy and warm and didn't apologize. She wrapped her few possessions in a cardboard box from the supply closet, the cracked mug from the break room that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a dying succulent that someone had given her 3 years ago and that she'd kept on her shelf as a joke about her own inability to sustain anything, and a photograph of her son in his navy dress whites, seal trident gleaming like a promise he'd already kept. The photo was from his pinning ceremony 4 years ago, his face young enough that the light still lived in his eyes, before the operations that had taught him how to operate in darkness and come back with less than he went in with. Her phone buzzed. 17 missed calls. All from blocked numbers. All from area codes she recognized from another life, Norfolk, San Diego, the Pentagon Exchange. She didn't answer any of them. She couldn't. The Navy didn't call former ghosts. Former ghosts didn't have phone numbers that could be answered. They had names that had been deleted from databases, files that had been redacted and reburied, records that had been classified so deeply that even Congress couldn't access them. She was supposed to have stayed invisible. 3 years. That was the duration of her sentence, complete erasure in exchange for allowing the Navy to bury the Tikrit operation along with the 12 operators she couldn't save. The operation that had gone sideways in ways that Command wanted forgotten. The operation that had made Major Megan O'Brien a liability, a witness, a problem that silence could solve. She stood at the bus stop on Richmond Avenue as the rain intensified, the cardboard box beginning to soften in her hands. A woman with an umbrella offered to share it. Megan shook her head, unable to form words, unable to explain that water couldn't touch her because she was already dissolved into the spaces between things. The dog tag beneath her scrubs, single, on a broken chain, the only physical proof of who she'd been, felt like an anchor dragging her down. She touched it through the fabric and felt the metal, cold and absolute. The tag had been struck from her name 3 years ago. The Navy had kept the matching pair. Somewhere in a classified file in Norfolk, another tag existed with her rank, her service number, her unit designation. But this one was hers. Contraband. Evidence. Insurance. The bus arrived with a hiss of hydraulics and diesel exhaust. Megan watched it pull to the curb, doors opening, the driver glancing at her with the blank patience of someone who picked up broken people for a living. She didn't board. Something held her in place, not hope, because she'd learned the cost of hope in Tikrit. Not fear, because she'd spent fear years ago in interrogation rooms that the Navy had officially denied ever existing. Something that felt like gravity pulling her downward, toward the earth that had already tried to claim her once. A black SUV pulled up behind the bus. No lights. No sirens. Just a government vehicle arriving at exactly the moment it needed to arrive, which meant someone had been tracking her, or the city, or the moment when she would finally break. The rear door opened and a man stepped out in Navy dress uniform, not combat fatigues but the dress blues that meant rank and institutional authority and the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice. His shoulders carried the weight of his insignia like a second skeleton. "Major O'Brien," he said. Not a question. Not a greeting. A statement of fact that had been classified until approximately 6 hours ago. Megan turned toward him, the cardboard box heavy in her arms, the photo of her son's face visible through a water-damaged corner. "That's not my name anymore," she said. Her voice was steady. The composure held. The mask stayed in place even as the world reconfigured itself around her. "You need to come with me." It wasn't a request. The officer's posture made that clear. His hand rested on the door handle like he was offering her a choice he'd already made for her. Why? Not asking. Stating. Because she already knew. The Navy didn't retrieve ghosts for conversation. They retrieved them when something had changed. Something had cracked the seal on her file. Something had made her existence relevant again when her entire purpose for 3 years had been irrelevance. The officer's expression shifted. The command authority in his face softened into something that resembled compassion, which was more dangerous than any order he could have given her. "The general is awake. He's asking for you." The rain fell harder. It drummed against the box, accelerating the cardboard's dissolution. Megan felt something move behind her ribs, a sensation she'd learned to identify in Tikrit as the precursor to either relief or devastation. Sometimes they looked identical from inside. "Tell him I was just doing my job." "He used your call sign." The officer's voice dropped, and in that drop was the entire weight of classified operations, of missions that had never officially happened, of the 12 operators whose names had been erased from every record she'd ever accessed. "He knows who you are." Her hand trembled. First time in 3 years. First time since she'd walked into Oak Creek Memorial and learned that her son's commanding officer was lying in an ICU bed with shrapnel in his chest and a collapsed lung and the kind of wounds that required medical intervention from someone who understood wounds on a cellular level, who understood pain as information, who understood that some people were worth the cost of resurrection. Her hand trembled and she hated it, hated the betrayal, hated the proof that her composure had limits, hated that the officer was looking at her with the expression people used when witnessing something breaking in real time. "Those records are buried," she said, but the words came out like a question. "Not anymore." He opened the SUV door wider. Rain blew sideways across the pavement, sheeting under the overhang where she was standing. "The general waited until you were out of the building. Then he started calling. Started talking. Started asking why the woman who saved his life 3 hours ago was a classified ghost, and why a decorated Marine officer would be erased from institutional memory just for following orders that command had given. He asked questions that required answers. The bus pulled away from the curb, moving without her. The rain fell on the empty space where it had been. Megan looked at the officer's extended hand, steady, weathered, the hand of someone who had worked with classified operatives long enough to know how to approach them. She looked at the black SUV, military plates, government authorization visible in the way the parking lot seemed to have cleared around it. She looked at the cardboard box in her arms, already destroyed, already ruined, already something that couldn't be saved by any intervention. She stepped forward. The officer didn't take the box from her, didn't presume to carry it. He simply held the door and let her move into the space beyond the rain, the space where the air inside the SUV was conditioned and controlled and smelled of government leather and the kind of authority that operated in the spaces between rules. The door closed behind her with the solid sound of things being sealed. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, movement smooth and deliberate, the kind of driving that came from professional training and the knowledge that the passenger in the back seat was traveling toward a revelation or a reckoning, and both possibilities required careful handling. The radio crackled once. Once. A voice said something in military phonetic alphabet. The driver responded in kind. The communication was sparse and technical and required no explanation. Megan sat with her ruined box and her dog tag and the photograph of her son's young face, and she waited for the next thing that the Navy had decided would happen to her. She had been erased once. Resurrection was supposedly impossible. But the general had said her call sign. He had asked the questions that couldn't be unasked. And somewhere in the classified bureaucracy of the Department of Defense, someone had decided that Major Megan O'Brien's resurrection was worth the cost. The vehicle turned toward Oak Creek Memorial. The television studio lights were white-hot and unforgiving. Dr. Caldwell sat in the guest chair with the posture of a man who still believed he controlled the narrative, his tie perfectly knotted, his jaw set at an angle meant to convey confidence. The local news anchor, a woman with 15 years of experience reading between the lines of institutional bullshit, leaned forward with professional interest. "So you're saying Major O'Brien fabricated her military credentials?" the anchor said, not quite a question. Caldwell nodded, a thin smile crossing his face like a knife finding its mark. "Entirely fabricated. I had to protect patient safety. When someone practices medicine without proper credentials, when they perform procedures they're not licensed for, the hospital has a duty to act. This woman endangered lives to feed her fantasy of being a war hero." His voice carried the practiced certainty of a man who'd spent 20 years getting his way. He straightened his cufflinks, a $3,200 Rolex caught the studio lights, and continued. "There's no evidence she served anywhere. No military records. Nothing. Just a troubled nurse with delusions of grandeur who attacked me when I held her accountable." He leaned back, satisfied. The narrative was his now. By morning, this story would be about a delusional woman, not about a physician who'd systematically dismantled her career. By tomorrow, he'd be the hero of the story he was telling. The anchor's earpiece crackled. Her expression shifted, a micro-movement, barely perceptible, but enough to tell Caldwell something had changed. She touched her ear, listening, and her eyes moved away from him. "We're getting a call," she said carefully. "The Secretary of the Navy is requesting to speak on air." Caldwell's jaw tightened. Not a visible flinch, he was too practiced for that, but his fingers gripped the armrest harder. The studio fell into that particular silence that precedes seismic shifts in power. The producer was on the phone, nodding at something being said on the other end. The secretary's voice came through the speakers, calm and measured, the kind of calm that comes from absolute authority. Dr. Caldwell attempted to terminate Major Megan O'Brien, a Navy officer with a Bronze Star, a Silver Star, and a Navy Cross, for saving a patient's life using emergency medical techniques she learned in combat operations. The secretary paused. His next words reached millions of viewers across Houston and beyond. "The medical board is reviewing his license for patient endangerment and for falsifying ICU schedules. The hospital is reviewing his medical privileges. And I want the American people to know what happens when someone tries to bury a hero." The anchor turned to Caldwell. "Doctor, would you like to respond?" Caldwell stood. His hands shook, not from fear, but from something far worse, the realization that the narrative was no longer his. He ripped the microphone from his lapel, the gesture violent enough to make it scratch against his silk tie. He walked off the set without speaking, his movements no longer controlled, no longer the composed physician. He was a man whose entire architecture of power had just collapsed on live television. The clip went viral within 7 minutes. By 11:16 p.m., #Caldwell lied was trending nationally. Phone-recorded videos from the hospital lobby circulated across every platform, grainy footage of Megan's identity reveal, the general standing despite his wounds to acknowledge her service, a nurse reading aloud the declassified file with shaking hands. In one video, someone had edited the audio to include the secretary's words overlaid on footage of Caldwell's face as he realized what was happening. The comments were a tsunami: decorated veteran, war hero, SEAL commander bearing witness, Secretary of the Navy on national television calling him a liar. By 12:33 a.m., Oak Creek Memorial's board had suspended Caldwell's credentials pending a full investigation into his scheduling practices, his pattern of terminating nurses who questioned his orders, and his falsification of ICU staffing records. By 1:15 a.m., his colleagues were issuing statements about how they'd always had concerns about his management style. By 2:13 a.m., the medical board had opened a formal investigation into his license. By dawn, his 20-year career at Oak Creek Memorial existed only in the hospital's archives and in the permanent record of his humiliation. The hospital's lawyers were already preparing for the litigation. Caldwell had violated at least 6 professional standards. He'd falsified scheduling documents. He deliberately removed experienced trauma staff from critical areas. He'd retaliated against a nurse for questioning his medical judgment. And he'd done it all while a Secretary of the Navy was willing to testify on the record that it happened. 6 months later, the investigation concluded: 2-year suspension of his medical license, mandatory anger management training, and a formal notation in his file that he'd been terminated for patient endangerment. No hospital system in Houston would hire him. No one would touch him. The only position available in a medical setting was night security at Oak Creek Memorial, the hospital where his humiliation had been broadcast to millions. Megan walked through the ICU corridors of Oak Creek Memorial wearing the white coat of clinical director. Her limp was still there, the consequence of a shrapnel wound that had never quite healed, but she no longer hid the scars on her forearms. The dog tag hung openly on its broken chain now, not tucked beneath her scrubs but visible against her collarbone. She'd had the chain repaired, but kept the break intentional, a scar made permanent. The corridors hummed with the particular silence of a night shift, monitors beeping their steady rhythms, ventilators wheezing their mechanical breaths. She paused at the glass walls of the ICU, the same walls where she'd performed a needle decompression on a general while 2 residents froze and 1 man tried to destroy her career. The wall where the entire hospital had watched her hands move with the precision of someone who'd done this before, in sandstorms, under fire, when the cost of hesitation was measured in lives. At 11:13 p.m., the staff entrance doors opened. Dr. Caldwell entered wearing a security guard uniform, navy blue with a gold badge and embroidered patch. The uniform hung on him like borrowed clothes. He was pushing a cart of cleaning supplies, the rattling of bottles and mops preceding him down the corridor. His face had aged 6 months in appearance, but the real damage was deeper, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd lost not just his position but his identity. He saw Megan watching from the ICU threshold. Their eyes met. Megan didn't move. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, one professional acknowledging another, with the kind of composure that only comes from surviving things that should have broken you. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He kept pushing his cart past the glass walls where she'd saved the general's life and where he'd tried to destroy her for doing it. The bottles clinked against each other as he moved, a sound like distant bells tolling something already finished. Later, in her office on the 3rd floor, Megan sat at her desk reviewing staffing requests when her son arrived in his dress uniform. He was a lieutenant now, and the sight of him, tall, steady, bearing the weight of command, made her throat tighten in a way she didn't expect. He handed her a shadow box without speaking. She opened it and saw them, the bronze star, the silver star, the 2 purple hearts, and finally, at the center, the Navy Cross. The medals had been declassified. They belonged to her now, visible, real, no longer something that could be erased. "The general wanted me to give you this," her son said. "He's done here. Back to the teams. But he wanted you to know that what you did, not just saving his life, but staying invisible to protect us all, that's the definition of honor." Megan ran her fingers across the Navy Cross. The metal was cool, real, substantial in a way that words could never be. "I spent 3 years thinking I had to stay invisible to stay alive," she said quietly. "Turns out the most dangerous thing I ever did was let someone else define my worth." Her son embraced her, the kind of embrace that doesn't need words. When he left, Megan hung the shadow box directly across from the window overlooking the ICU. She watched Caldwell push his cleaning supplies past those same glass walls, and she understood something that institutional power could never teach: the difference between authority and strength. Some people wielded power like a weapon, trying to break things. Others used it like a shield, protecting things that mattered. She turned to her computer and approved 3 staffing requests from nurses who needed family leave. Caldwell would have denied them. She would approve them. At the bottom of each approval, she typed a single sentence: "Power is not a title." Power is the ability to help. She hit send and returned to her work, pulling up the night shift schedule, making sure every vulnerable patient had the best nurse available, that no one on her watch would be invisible, that no one would be thrown into crisis without the right people standing beside them. Outside, Houston hummed with the particular silence of late night, and somewhere in a security office, Dr. Caldwell was learning what it felt like to be seen and measured by the very woman he'd tried to erase. The victory wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was permanent. And it tasted like justice served without the need to gloat. If you watched this story, you witnessed something that happens quietly every day in hospitals and workplaces across America: the cost of underestimating someone. The danger of confusing silence with weakness. The power of quiet dignity in the face of systematic humiliation. Major Megan O'Brien's story isn't unique because she was special, it's unique because she was invisible, and invisible people often have the most profound strength. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had your credentials questioned, if you've ever had to stay silent to survive, share this story. Let people know that truth has a way of surfacing, that heroes walk among us in scrubs and combat boots, and that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. Subscribe. Like. Comment whether you would have done the same. Because stories like this one deserve to be heard, and people like Megan deserve to be seen.